Hello, I'm Sunshine Baker, and yes, that is my real name. How many of you here would admit that you avoid conflict? I'm with you, and I probably have more reason than most to fear and avoid conflict. I was raised by wonderful parents in Washington, D.C., was a National Merit Scholar at a prestigious school, and everyone had high hopes for my future. I unwisely got married at 18, and my first husband turned out to be bipolar. Over the course of our 17-year marriage, our arguments were terrifying, ending once with me in the hospital, and another time I jumped out of a moving car to escape an intense rage session. He constantly berated me and mocked everything I said and did. Any social occasion, like a work party, would end with a play-by-play recap, telling me how everything I said was inappropriate and wrong. On the outside, I looked happy, but I was constantly trying to minimize conflict and keep the peace to avoid his wrath. I secretly tried to figure out ways to escape this marriage with my life. One night, I heard my husband tell our 2 children that something was going to happen to Daddy and Mommy, but that there were lots of good friends and relatives that they could call that would take care of them. 3 days later, his bipolar disease ended up destroying him when he took his own life. The day that he died, I vowed that violent conflict would never again enter my home. I became passionately interested in learning how to have peaceful and healthy relationships. Because of my past, I thought that meant that I had to have a life completely free of conflict. But then I began attending classes at UCF studying interpersonal communication. And one of the first classes I took was conflict management. On the first day of class, Professor Sandoval showed us this slide. This is the Chinese symbol for conflict, and it combines the words for challenge and opportunity. She explained that conflict is not a bad thing to be feared, but instead, in every conflict, we have an opportunity to build better relationships. I became passionately interested in learning how to have conflicts that build instead of destroy. I worked on several research studies, and one of the best things I learned was that it's not bad to argue. Problems arise when people become verbally or physically aggressive during conflict, but this is not the only way. And in the midst of this quest, I fell in love, and on 12/12/12, I got married. Luckily, Rick shares my passion for peaceful communication and has learned about conflict along with me. On our first road trip together, we listened to a podcast from my favorite conflict expert, Dr. John Gottman. Gottman is a psychologist who has studied couples in conflict for over 30 years. He has a love lab where the same couples come every year and live in an apartment for one weekend. He measures their urine, heart rate, perspiration, and level of emotional distress to figure out the effects of different types of conflict. He's used this information to find what conflict behaviors go along with healthy marriage. And because of that, if he talks to you for 5 minutes as a couple, he can tell you with 90% accuracy if you will divorce. So I'm going to share with you guys some of the skills that I've learned that have helped me to approach conflict head-on without the panic and fear I used to experience. One of my favorite metaphors for conflict is a soccer ball. When we're having a conflict, we think of the issue as a soccer ball that we pass back and forth between the 2 of us. The problem is a separate thing outside of us that we kick around until we figure out how to fix it. Let's say we're talking about the same old perennial marital issue, household chores. If I say, "You're just a lazy, selfish slob," call my husband names, it's like taking the problem, cutting a hole in his chest and throwing the problem into it. Instead, we keep the problem outside of us and tackle it together until we get it fixed without attacking each other. Personal attacks like that are one of the things that Gottman calls the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse: criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling. These are the things that lead, usually inevitably, to divorce. And guess what is the #1 nonverbal signal that a couple will break up? It's eye rolling. Let's say we're at a picnic, and my husband is telling a friend about his latest work project. If I stand there next to him and roll my eyes at our friend, I'm disassociating myself from my husband. I'm saying basically he's an idiot, and I'm embarrassed to be with him. And that's not good. So we know we have to avoid these 4 horsemen, but what are some positive things we can do to keep a relationship growing? My favorite of Gottman's practices is turning towards, and this one applies to all relationships, not just marriage. Let's say we're looking out at a harbor, and Rick says, "That's a pretty boat." Well, I could just ignore him and go about my business. I could do a little tiny response like going, But the best thing to do is to turn towards him enthusiastically. I'll say, that's a pretty boat. He'll say, that's a pretty boat. And I'll say, yes, that is a pretty boat. I love how we can appreciate things of beauty together. That's one of my favorite things about you. And maybe someday we can get a boat like that. If we did, where would we go? Well, you don't have to do that every time. That is a bit much. Extreme example. But when you do, you'll build up a reserve of positive emotions that Gottman calls positive sentiment override. And when you're in this state, you can resolve conflicts better because you're friends and you've built up that history together. So one of the other tips I've found is take a walk. When you have to have a big, heavy talk, just take a walk together. Walking reduces flooding. That's your physical overload. When you get all sweaty and red and your heart is racing and you're just feel all tense in your throat, that happens when you have a conflict. When you're walking, that just kind of burns off. And one of the reasons that works is because of the minimal eye contact. Studies have shown that men actually prefer conversations side by side while they're doing things together. And it just makes things less confrontational, so you don't feel like they're right up in your face. So next time you feel like you have to have a heavy discussion, take a walk. It works for Kim and Kanye. So Rick and I have been able to use these tips to build a happy relationship over the last 2 years. Instead of fleeing conflict and being afraid of it, we've been able to handle it head on. So I'm living proof that you can learn to handle conflict well, and it's worth it.